all kinds of things, but specifically art. So we put together a little panel of passionate art patrons, actually. As a start, we hope to do this more frequently. We would start with our own local, low-felt passion in art. And I want to introduce very, very briefly, and then I think each one of Karin and Henri will say a few words, and then we'll get into the questions. So, Henri, welcome. Welcome to our gallery. You've been to our gallery so many times, but today in a more official capacity, which is just such a privilege for us.
Thank you.
I do want to say that Henri was the first person to buy the first piece of art on the first day that the gallery opened in 2018. Yes, and immediately understood that there was a deeply rooted passion for art. Henri, I think that more than just an art, and you don't like to call yourself an art collector, but there is certainly elements of collecting that you display. But I think that more than an art collector, you also are incredibly passionate about the art ecosystem or the art biosphere, the different players in the art market, why things happen the way they do. And I think that you have been probably one of the most avid gallery goers that I know. So we are really looking forward to tapping into your knowledge. Also, I think such a promoter of the arts in Mozambique in terms of your role as Hollard, as the CEO of Hollard in Mozambique. Really, really flying that flag for the Mozambican artists, the Mozambican art market. Should I? Yeah, really I think, Henri, yes, it's a response.
Okay, well, thank you, Donna. I mean, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, but I need to qualify the title of collector. And as Donna said, I was completely flattered when Donna called me up and said, Henri, I'd like you to be part of the panel. And I said to her, Donna, I actually don't see myself as a collector. And looking for words, I think I said to you, I'm an accumulator of art. It's not really a collector. But in terms of thinking about it and, sort of walking through, and for those of you that have been to my house and walking through what I call the gallery space and the likes, I suppose it's unfair to just simply say accumulator of art. There is an interaction with art, and there is a reflection, I think, from the pieces that I buy that kind of identify myself and Samantha in my life in there, and so I suppose we need to acknowledge that the bug has bitten us, so to speak. So, but the reason, and I also said that, from an anonymous point of view, I prefer to remain anonymous, but at the same time, there's this complete understanding from my side, and especially in the last few years, and just interacting with galleries across the country, and when we visit overseas, I visit, for those of you that have travelled with us or plan an overseas trip with Samantha and I, the big bugbear was, well, Henri needs to go to this gallery, and goes to this gallery, and everybody raises their eyebrows because I spent too long in galleries. But the understanding that the art world is a very delicate ecosystem, as Donna has reflected, and we as buyers, patrons, appreciators are a very important element in that ecosystem, as are the artists and the emerging artists and the gallerists. In other environments, more mature environments, you've even got advisors on art collections, which is even on top of the gallerist. And I think this initiative from Donna which is really a series of initiatives since you taking over the gallery in 2017, Donna. You've really upped the level of what we are exposed to here in the Lowveld. The gallery to me is a reference point. It's almost it's a very important reference point for us as a community. And so it's important for me to be part of this panel and support a fantastic initiative. And I hope it becomes more regular in terms of the conversation and the conversations from us as a community. And so I need to qualify that I am as much a collector as a lot of you guys here. So please look at me as being part of the panel as representing you guys, and I think there's going to be a question and answer session and the like. So it's really around that the reason why I'm here in front of you guys.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you. I mean, it's lovely that you're here, and lovely that I think it's an important point to say that you represent all of us. I'm going to start off with a whole lot of questions, but before I do, I think Karin needs very little introduction. Karin is definitely one of our most accomplished artists in the Lowveld. But more than that, Karin's played such a big role and so many different roles in promoting art in the Lowveld, not only for different galleries, but certainly for different artists. She's been an educator. There's many artists here who have had some guidance from Karin, some mentorship from Karin, and I think more than that, I think Karin is incredibly play an integral role in our gallery and has certainly served to shape our gallery over the last while. So, but in terms of Karin being here today, I think we are looking for Karin from the view of how Karin might be interacting with collectors specifically, and her insight into collecting with buyers of her work. So we're going to tap into that. Anything to add to that?
We're going to tap into that, but I can only be an artist. So here I am. And I wanted to say a few words, ask for a few opening words. And it's been going round and round in my head because there's a lot going on in this head. And two words kind of distilled out for me, and they are obsession and authenticity. And I think obsession needs no introduction. We all know what it means, and believe me, successful practicing artists are obsessed. They have to be. An artist has to need to make a work. You find that it's not just a day job, it's an all-day job and all night. So it's almost as if I know my work is successful for me if I felt like it always needed to be made. So if you're looking for art to collect, that's kind of, I think, your first stop. Is that work needs to exist. And then the other word is authenticity. And I think if you're thinking in terms of collecting, you want to know that the artist and their work is authentic. And then how to establish that authenticity it's tricky, but I think we all have a gut feel for it. You can walk into a gallery of work and look at something, it will resonate with you, and usually there's kind of authenticity to it. Obviously it resonates with you for specific reasons, but yeah, authenticity. And establishing authenticity is a bit more tricky than obsession, but I think the internet has become our friend. And I really do urge you to all do your research, because artists now are so much more accessible than they ever were, and it's changed the landscape of collecting. So I think the artists' relationships with galleries have changed, because the artists essentially have a worldwide gallery that they can use to expose themselves to a greater audience. So I've been thinking about that point, and for me, I've come to realize that I need both. I need my internet audience and I need galleries. Galleries give you something that the internet can't give you. And I think we can end there.
Good. Good. Okay, so I've got a list of questions.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you, and as you go along, you're going to have, you all also have questions and probably have more questions. I think what we're going to do is we're going to start off the conversation with a few questions of each other and then open to the floor. So, and then hopefully we can field some of your queries. So if I could ask Henri, you know, if you think about the things that you can collect, cars, watches, somebody mentioned yesterday, whiskey hip flasks that you can collect as well, antique furniture. Why art, Henri? What was it about art that absolutely, you know, sparked your imagination to say this is, or was it a conscious decision, or was it simply I'm going to buy my first artwork and there you go?
It's an interesting question, and when you think about it, I think that I've understood that I'm a very visual person, and being a very visual person, very aware of surround and the surrounding atmosphere, and I think the visual arts, and it's not to say that I don't collect music, for example, and I don't collect other things, but obviously the visual arts it's always there. You walk past it, you'll sit in front of it, you'll interact with it. As you lift up your head from your desk, you're interacting and it's speaking to you all the time. And it absolutely fascinates me. It fascinates me that a piece of art can consistently do this. You know, drawn, for example, to the picture at the back of the gallery. I mean, it just draws you in all the time. You're interacting with it as we speak. So I think it's simply that, and it's simply that. Is it a characteristic? Maybe it's certain of us. I suppose not everybody is the same. That visual emotion and that longing for that visual emotion, and certain art pieces, you know what I mean. It's something that talks to you. So I think that's why.
Because you wouldn't necessarily.
It's probably not only limited to art, which also talks to design. A piece of furniture. An Eames lounge chair designed in 1956 in terms of understanding it. You sort of relate to objects that are consistently messaging back to you. I think that's why.
And do you remember your first art purchase?
Yeah, I actually do. I think we were overseas. I was in, I think, my matric year. We were overseas and at a gallery, and I convinced my dad that I was sailing at the time, and there was an art piece of a wave. It was a painting, oil on canvas of a wave, cresting coming, and I didn't have the money at the time, but I convinced my dad to lend me the money to buy that particular art piece. So he was a little bit sort of eyebrow open.
So can I tell you about my first art sale? Because our local audience will appreciate this. So I was a newbie in the Lowveld, and I was lonely and miserable, and I couldn't speak Afrikaans, and I was living with my boyfriend, and I wore leather sandals, and I liked coffee shops, and there were no coffee shops, so I was really a fish out of water. And
you still wear leather sandals?
Yes. Thank goodness the Lowveld was caught up into me. And I was poor, very, very poor, and all I could do was make art with my hands. And so I did. I made some paintings, and I went to something called Art in the Park, which used to be outside the municipal buildings, a little lawn where they put danger tape to show where you could put your work out on the grass, and we had to make some little stick things to balance the art. And one of the first people to walk past looked at me and said, "Achmea si smile." And then I sold 2 works for a total of about 900 rand, which was more money than I could have dreamt about that long ago. And those were my first sales.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It must have felt.
Oh my goodness, we went out to dinner. I had a Siciliana pizza.
Obviously a very memorable day.
But yeah, you think about the buyers, but you also need to think about the impact on an artist. It's incredibly encouraging to sell work. It's for me not an ego boost, it's permission to carry on and the ability to carry on because the money is coming in.
Talking about art in the park, yeah, because when I lived in Joburg, in terms of finishing high school, went to varsity army and that sort of thing, so art in the park at Zoo Lake, consistently, every month I was there. And you talk about one of the first ones was Daniel Mbele. I think you've seen that piece. It's still at my house.
Yeah. And Karin, obviously going back, at what point did you actually see yourself as you obviously furthered your studies in art, right? You took art, you had art at high school and you furthered your studies. Did you see yourself did you see yourself evolving into the career of an artist? Or
No.
how did you see yourself going with that?
It's the strangest thing because, again, I loved art at school, it was my sanctuary. And then, out of the blue, when I was in standard 9, I announced to my father that I'd be doing fine art, which was a big disappointment because he wanted me to be a marine biologist. But it was as if it came out of the blue that I suddenly knew that that's what I wanted to do. But I hadn't thought any further than doing a degree. And then when I was studying, there was no help in that area because it was almost verboten to talk about the art market or to talk about pricing work or selling work. It was so academic that the lecturers wouldn't tolerate any suggestion of that. Things have changed now, but in those days it was pure academia. And so I left university not knowing a thing about how to be an artist, how to have a practice. And I learned it through trial and error. So at the time my mind hadn't gone there, which is odd because my mind was supposed to like to plan. But then when I sold my work in the art in the park, then I started to think, well, maybe it's possible.
I think what's interesting for me is, we just discussed, like, where did you start? How did it start? And it's now, I have to say, decades later.
Yeah.
And so I think what's fascinating for me is how have the changes that if you think back, Karin, to those days where you were starting and to where you are now, how have you changed as an artist? Well, it's probably difficult to just say it in a sentence, but
It's quite doable.
yes, I'm interested to know.
I haven't really changed in the sense that it doesn't get any easier, and art keeps one very humble. So it sounds true, but you're only really as good as your last painting because it's a work in progress. As much as a painting is a work in progress, so is an artist, because one evolves with one's work evolves with the artist. And so I deliberately tried to remain kind of open like that. I'll never say to myself, or even dare to think, now I've made it, now this is good, now I'm good, now I know what I'm doing, because that's when it'll come from behind you and say hello.
Amazing as one always has that opportunity to learn or to
I'm sure most artists would agree. As soon as you settle and think, okay, this is what I'm good at and this is what I'm going to do, actually, then it falls apart.
Yes. And Henri, turning to you, you've obviously, from those days, from your first Daniel Mbele, and the artwork that you brought of the wave, to now, I mean, how have you grown your knowledge? How have you, obviously you visited many galleries and on extensive travel, so you've got such a broad, but is there anything else that you specifically do to grow your knowledge?
I suppose, for me, there's a couple of things in terms of started with a very basic thing in terms of disposable income, in terms of as we getting older, the parameters of what I suddenly have access to is chalk and cheese to studying days and the like. So your parameters open up on that basis. But Donna, essentially you're talking about a taste. It's you pick up an artist like, I suppose, you would pick up a musician, and you identify that artist as having tweaked your interest. And what essentially I do is I record each artist over the years that have tweaked my interest. And some of them are dead, but a lot of them are very much alive. And there's different reasons why they affected or engaged, or I engaged with their particular work. And I tend to follow their work through, I suppose, just research, just understanding on the social media and the likes, just looking for a development and looking for that artist growing into wherever they're going, and like a musician, and like you would follow a musician, so too I follow artists. And if I have the opportunity, if an opportunity comes, which is a huge privilege, to own one of the art pieces, lovely. It's that's really the, and so I think my taste development has been expanded around that. It's just watching and researching and following those artists that I rate personally.
Yes. Well,
it's a personal taste.
And what happens? I'm just visualizing your collection. I'm saying collection, but it is.
I know
it is a
collector.
Yes, it's just
This is how to know to collect.
So if I visualize your collection, it is incredibly diverse. It includes different mediums. It includes different subject matters. Have you ever felt that artworks that you purchased in earlier years no longer speak to you, possibly the way that they spoke to you when you were younger? What do you do with them, or are they a story of your journey, and do you still enjoy them as much as you did so many decades ago?
So they're different pieces, and each piece tells a different story, and certain stories never leave the sort of the trajectory, and certain of the stories kind of, you look back and say, well, that's quite naive now, or that's quite outdated, and I've had enough of that, and let's move on. Somebody once defined a collector to me as somebody that would, somebody that sold their art to purchase new art to replace. I don't do that often. The pieces are upstairs in the loft. The older pieces are upstairs, wrapped in the loft. But I suppose, in a sense, they're out of my visual being. So I think it's certainly an involvement, but as your taste changes, and it does change. And
It does. It has to change.
It has to change.
Yes. Yeah.
Different aspects, different times of your life, what's going on around you, that sort of thing. If we talk about art as a communication, it's obviously that certain pieces will lose their meaning, and certain pieces won't. Yeah.
I think that's probably the reason why the artwork by Odette is so relevant for me. I think so many artists over the last 2 years have painted people with masks, and I'm fascinated as to how that speaks specifically to that time. And in decades going forward, we'll probably look back and say, did that really happen to us? And that is the beauty of how art reminds us of a particular time.
Yeah.
It's evidence. Yeah. Evidence, absolutely. Absolutely. Karen, I had a question for you. Often I am intrigued with artists that have a fantastic recipe that works, and they would paint, and yet there's an experiment inside, a place inside that is not necessarily known in the market. It's not playful, it's probably more experimental, but so I guess what I want to know is, do you paint with anybody in mind? Do you paint with somebody that you might think, well, this gallery will really enjoy this work, or I know that person, do you paint for the market or not?
No,
Okay.
emphatically no.
Good.
And I hope I never will. I don't think one can be a true artist and do that, but it's a luxury to be able to say that. Although I probably could financially do a lot better if I didn't cater to that, but I can't. It just doesn't work for me. The minute I have to think about that, it just dies. And really, what it boils down to is, if I try to do that and it ruins my art world, my inner world for me, then I'm killing what I love most. So I won't. That sort of leads on to the idea of commissions. I think commissions almost embody that concept. I don't take commissions because it's the same thing. They will take me 3 or 4 times longer than an artwork that I needed to make. And that artwork is not my idea, it's the commissioner's idea. So also I don't recommend that people commission work if they're serious about collecting. And then there are things like, there are artists who make wonderful portraits of pets, and I think it's amazing, and that's an area in which commissions would be relevant. But if you're making art that is running alongside your life, which is, I think, fulfilled artists do that. Their life and their work are inextricably linked. They have to be congruent. So if for instance I'm going through an incredibly productive, happy, energized phase, you'll see it in my work, and then the opposite too. And as a collective, if you follow artists, you'll see those phases. You go through them all the time, and it needs to be congruent with your life. So as soon as it's not congruent with the authentic me, the creativity dries up. So no.
Karin, can we take a minute to just look at the work and how your work has changed over a period of time? I'm so fascinated with this, and I know this is empty, but if I could bring these 2 works, which I sit at Karin's studio and I'm so drawn to them because they're always a little bit out of reach. But I look at these early works of Karin's, and then we put up to show how Karin's work has changed. A more recent, this one is a lithograph, and it was produced in a few years ago, 2019. But it is just incredible to see the involvement of the work, much more finer rendering of your subject matter, whether it be in whatever medium, whereas this is quite fascinating me. I also love this, I must say. So
Yeah, I do too, and for what it is,
yes,
or when it was.
yes, yeah.
And when was that?
30 years ago? Maybe 25.
Wow.
Would you ever? Do you think you'd ever go back to taking this style?
I don't think that's. No, it's not a question of going back. I brought it with me. So as it's evolved within me, I can see. It's so interesting to me. That's why I keep them out. They're not the best paintings I've ever made, but they have the roots of a lot of what I've experimented with and developed over the years. So the little zing yellow, lemon yellow spot makes no sense. I remember putting it down there thinking this makes no sense, but I'm going to put it here almost like a placeholder or a reminder or a counterpoint on which everything else is painted is balanced, and also for a subsequent painting. And also it happens to be a place where I spent some incredibly valuable hours. A local artist who we've spoken about, she had a farm outside town, wild and wonderful. And when I had small children and I was teaching, I had very little headspace and time to work on my own work. And she was wonderful. She used to say to me, on Fridays you come to me, and I'd go. She would feed me, she'd give me endless cups of tea, she'd put the easel out, and I would paint. And she gave me that space in which to experiment. And so there were times of that. But I can see the struggles, I can see little hints of what's to come. And it's difficult to say that involved into this, because this being a lithograph, it's an entirely different medium to oil painting. So it would be very difficult to do that in a lithograph anyway. But yes, it's more fun.
And I'm looking forward, Karin, to seeing what new work, a new collection or new series of work that you're producing for your exhibition at Gallery 2 in
It's actually interesting, Donna's nudge that got me going with the pastel. It's an entirely pastel exhibition. And Donna said to me, "What about trying something new?" It was specifically for something that didn't actually work out, but the pastel word stuck with me. And I used to pastel also 35 years ago now. And I haven't touched it for 30 years. And the pastels are funny enough closer to the original oils. I think because pastels come with limitations. They're clunky sticks of pigment. And so the kind of mark that you can make is not this kind of mark or a pencil mark. And also the colour palette is limited. It's not so that I have to mix the colours in order to get a colour with pastel. It gets very mushy. So those limitations are almost akin to the limitations I had when I was at the beginning of my learning curve. And it's quite nice. It's quite empowering to have those limitations, because nowadays I can do almost anything I want with paint. And I think it was Picasso who said, I wish I could. Something about learning to paint like a child. And I think a lot of artists do that with evolution. So
fascinating. I must say, I absolutely love those. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the pastels.
Can I ask Karin a question? Karin, you mentioned you're not happy technically with the paintings. I mean, I think they're wonderful. But in terms of the difference between a trained artist and a sort of somebody that paints by the natural instinct, by the gut, we're assisting quite a lot of emerging artists in Mozambique, as Donna has mentioned. And I don't think anyone, I think it's fair to say, I think not one of those 5 very, very good artists that have actually been exhibited even overseas, but not one of them has been officially, trained. is there space for that? What's your view?
There's
on that?
absolutely space for it, and I don't think one is better than the other, or good or bad. The idea of good and bad art is really troublesome. Art is about our humanity, so however we can express that, I think it's worthwhile. I'm very grateful that I could be trained, because I think probably the most marked difference is that my training came with an art history background too, so we did 3 years of art history, really intense everyday lectures, and that kind of informs the way you see artwork, and I can see the influence in those. I'm closer to my training years than where you can see a little bit of Cezanne. It's pretentious of me to say that, but I was like grappling with those, the way that they saw the world, and I wanted to kind of integrate it into my work. The minute I left university and was free of critiques by the lecturers and art history, I want to say I almost regressed a little bit. I became like a child, and I always paint what I want to paint because nobody's going to tell me what to do. And that was probably also quite good. But there's a wealth of artists in this country that are not formally trained, and I think we can't discount that. We have to support it and acknowledge it. The other thing is an artist continues to learn through their career. And I think as long as you're on the learning curve, no matter where you come from and where you started, it's good.
You're producing the same thing because the market wants you to produce the same thing.
I think personally for me, I find that people who have not been trained are more vulnerable because tend to be a little bit more influenced by what they think may sell. That vulnerability, they need to start selling quickly, usually, because very often somebody who couldn't afford training needs to sell work. So yeah, it's a field we all need to be very aware of and supportive of.
Henri, I've got a question. Maybe a few of you may be thinking this, but if you had to give advice to anybody that said, I would like to start a collection. I'm sure that many of you here have already purchased an artwork, but what would you suggest to our audience they would need to look for if they were going to put together, or if they were going to start a collection?
It's a difficult question to answer because there's so many different dimensions to that question. I think you need to start off in terms of the reason why you want to start a collection. There are people out there that look at art as simply an asset class, as an investment, and they want to diverse in terms of their portfolio of assets. I think somebody was mentioning just now in terms of just from a community point of view, point of view in terms of the years gone by, the Jewish society, looked at art as a quick get out of country type of asset, a quick purchase type of asset. So, there's various reasons why somebody would go into starting a collection. I think fundamentally, I love Karin's word authenticity. The reason why you start a collection is because you interact, you love it, and you certainly, naturally you're going to purchase something, an object, a piece that talks to you. And so I suppose, fundamentally, if it talks to you, if it says something to you, then just start your collection, I suppose. At the end of the day, simply start your collection. And it comes naturally. I mean, you asked, certainly my accumulation of art pieces at the home, you sit back and look and say, there's a theme, there's a kind of a, I mean, we talked about colour the other day. There's an underlying very, very strong vibe in terms of my collections, colour and a reflection back at the spaces. And please believe me, I hate buying art to decorate a room. I like to think that we don't do that. But it naturally happens, even in its very eclectic way. It molds itself into our living space.
If you buy it with authenticity, it will work in your home. It doesn't matter if it doesn't match the colour.
Exactly.
It's got to match your personality.
So Dara, I think to answer that question is, if you're starting a collection, then do it from the heart. Do it from authenticity's side more than anything else. Buy what you love. Look, I mean, if you're going into the asset class, if you're going into the trophy hunting scenario, that's a different mindset. And probably I'm not the one to advise in terms of doing that. That's a whole different game that you're going to. I mean, you're speculating on art. There is also, I mean, there's an underlying. Every time I spend my hard-earned cash to buy a piece, I do believe that it will retain its value, and there's an intrinsic value in art.
So Henry, do you have any idea how it will maintain that value?
How it will maintain that value?
What maintains that value?
So I often look at a piece that I would like to purchase and I ask myself the question, would this hold its own in a museum in 10, 20 years' time? And even if that museum is a White River museum or a regional museum, there are possibly pieces there that will hold its own in an international museum. It could be. And I like to defend each one of those pieces. I could justify it being in a museum. So if I can do that, I intrinsically believe that it will hold its value. It holds its value. Value is,
Now, I ask the question because I think that artists have a responsibility in that sense, that I take that quite seriously. If I sell a work to somebody, I sold work to people, okay? The work that I produce subsequently, it's that word congruent again. It must be congruent with the pricing, the standard, and so artists are responsible for not suddenly dropping their price drastically in order to make a sale, or hiking their prices drastically in order to make a quick buck. I think there's a kind of responsibility in that sense.
And even the basics. I was talking to a gallerist the other day about supporting up-and-coming young artists. The paints that they use, the canvases that they use, that's so important. These things have a habit of sort of degrading if you're not using the right quality canvas, the right quality paints, and that sort of thing. You also need to watch that a little bit, and especially if you're supporting up-and-coming.
It's a tricky one, though.
It is a tricky one. Material is expensive.
I spend a fortune. I mean, I actually meant to bring a little 37mm tube of Windsor Newton Artist oils, 270 rand at the cheapest.
But that's where I kind of see the ecosystem that is so important, and that's what a responsibility of a good gallerist in terms of, they will find an artist, and together with the community and the collectors and the patrons, we need to sort of support.
It's troublesome when it becomes a barrier to entry for young artists, perhaps not untrained artists. And so, I don't have any easy answers, but it is a barrier to entry. And then we tend to find people using things that are a bit gimmicky and not line fast, like coffee. And then that also then grows into something that perhaps a number of collectors will say, oh, it's a novel, I should buy that. It's tricky because it's not archival in any sense.
Yeah.
It's going to fade. And then that's what I meant by an artist who's not trained is vulnerable, because they may then become convinced that coffee is the way to go and develop a whole career based on coffee. And where does that leave a collector?
But this valued subject is really a subject that we can have a whole panel discussion on.
Entire panel discussion just on that. And I mean, I'm watching your time, and I realize that it's 15 minutes, and we said that we finished by 12, and we've got so much to discuss, and we have 15 minutes. So I think that we are very happy to extend our discussion, but I'm just wondering if it isn't an opportunity to open to the floor.
Can I ask you one thing, Donna?
Yes.
You haven't actually answered any questions.
I haven't answered any questions.
I'd like to know, what is your most satisfying type of sale? What makes you excited to come to the gallery and do this?
So, firstly, I have to say that if we have a visitor to the gallery and we have many that just come and look, it is absolutely amazing. I think the most rewarding time when we have clients in the gallery is if they are willing to engage and they do ask questions and they do, and you can see immediately if somebody is really, really interested. I think that's one of the most rewarding things that I do is to chat to anybody that's just simply an observer in the gallery. I think when it comes to somebody who's willing to purchase or is interested in purchasing, the most rewarding thing for me is to be able to share something that the buyer didn't know. Open the eyes, open their minds in terms of knowledge, see something in a different way, see something in a different angle. Somebody's eyes open and say, okay, I see that now. So engagement with the client, and if there's a sale as a result of engagement with the client, it is just the most special thing. I think for me, it is about building relationships with our clients. So I always try and work on the basis that it's never a once-off interaction, that it would be something that we would be able to engage with over a longer period of time. It also is incredibly satisfying to go to a client's home and say, there is an artwork. It would be amazing to see it in your home. Can I bring it? Because that teaches me so much about the client, what their energy is about. And to be able to present an artwork in somebody's home is just the most wonderful thing. And we do that. So if there's anybody out there who's ever seen one of our artworks on the wall and says, gee, I wonder how it would look on my wall, please do let us know, because we will bring it and we'll talk about why it works here or why it doesn't. So that is a rewarding. If a client walks in and says, I'll take that, without much discussion, we're very joyful, and we do, but it is so much more rewarding when we actually have enlightened or shared something that the client didn't know, and hopefully that it also is the start of another relationship.
And then that would lead on to your relationship with artists, because you can't actually impart any information without knowing where that artwork came from and why the artwork exists.
Absolutely. So for me, a studio visit is just one of the most treasured activities or treasured visits that I do, is to actually spend time with an artist in their studio. It's actually then really get to understand when you're immersed in conversation, and regular visits I think are also important, because artists work on different things. Sometimes there are particular circumstances that result in the artist producing a certain type of work. We really need to be on top of that as gallerists, and I think we are a conduit in a sense. We have to pass on the information that the artist would have wanted the client to hear, and it's incredibly, to be the custodian of that information and pass it over correctly is a privilege. It really is. So yeah, it's very, very important to be able to actually reflect exactly what the artist would have reflected if they were talking themselves.
And then, as an artist, I am fussy. I think a lot of artists feel this way about the galleries that I interact with, because I've had a few learning curves and bad experiences that really were not conducive to me making better art. And that's part of the reason why I love working with Donna, is because she never dictates what I should be making. Not once have you said, okay, you mentioned pastels, but that's entirely different. It's technical. But the minute a gallery would say to me, you know, you should make more of that, it sells well, I would be like a deer in the headlights. Too quick. So that's my kind of standard. It's a personal thing for me, that I need to be able to work with the galleries but not be dictated to. And you do that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that in fact art in general, you both alluded to it. It just keeps you on your toes, and it just teaches you something new every day. There isn't a moment when you can stop and say, you know, we've got, we know.
I know the recipe. There's no recipe.
There's no recipe. There's always, when you think, okay, we've got it. I mean, how many exhibitions that we've had where we've put beautiful work on the wall, the artwork that you think is absolutely going to be the favorite isn't, or vice versa. And so it is constantly a journey of learning and enlightenment. It is actually quite incredible. It's an absolute privilege to be a gallerist. Just wonderful, yeah.
Good fun. Donna, do you classify your client base, your collectors? In terms of, we haven't quite, the definition for collectors is going to be something much talked about at this gallery.
Yes.
But do you classify your collectors, and do you match your artists to certain collectors?
I think we have we classify them, I think, very intuitively. I don't think it's a formal process that we go through. We certainly like to think that we have a feel for what certain clients like. I think possibly going forward we could do more to actually grow our collectors base by knowing a little bit more about what our viewers actually enjoy and like. So I think it's more of an intuitive process actually. It is about seeing work that you think, I know that this person would love that. I do need to give them a call and say, come on, you need to come and see this exhibition. This exhibition would really talk to you in terms of the work that you love. So very much an intuitive process. I think rather than a formal, okay, let's have a list of these people and a list of these people and a list, I think possibly even the gallery might be better at that going forward. And I think part of us having talks like this, and hopefully more talks like this in the future, is to actually grow as a gallery and grow in terms of our ability to match certain artworks with certain clients.
And then also have to expose your audience to things that they may not have even dreamed of yet. So that,
And specifically for this selection of work, it's not an exhibition, but it's just a selection of work. I think I put up a piece that is incredibly abstract. This little work comes from the Turbine Art Fair 3 weeks ago by Jean Hoffman, who's doing incredible work in the field of abstraction. I am so excited about learning more about how abstract art works. And almost with our viewership going on a journey together to understand this work better. So there might be pieces that you see around the gallery that we don't normally show, but I think we need to expand how, what people see in the gallery on a regular basis. But that is, it's very much part of our vision going forward, is to really have pieces on the walls that people do not expect. Yeah. Question time. I'm sure there are many that you'd like to
My question is for Donna, because I've been out of the load for a long time. I'm really interested to know, and maybe a lot of people here already know, how did you become a gallerist? What for you is important? Because there's obviously, and what makes a good curator of either an exhibition or this sort of thing. There's obviously a big difference between someone who's curating a permanent exhibition for a big gallery of Rembrandts and whatever, and something like this. But you're such a critically important link between the artist and the buyer. And I know, as Karin says, now there's the internet, but I mean, so many people must be introduced to an artist for the first time because they see something on the gallery. Can you talk a bit more about that?
So I have to say that I'm a self-taught gallerist. So you were talking about the artists that have been, and I have had no formal training in art. Everything that I do is as a result of 10 years of experience as a gallerist, probably a little bit longer. But from a very young age, I was absolutely fascinated with art. And so all my friends would put up their posters of their pop icons, and I would take all my pocket money, and there was a shop in Pretoria in the middle of town called Schweikert's. And Schweikert's downstairs sold postcards of the masters. And I would go and buy those postcards, and I would put them all over my wall. And they were next to nothing, but I absolutely loved that. And so from a very, very young age, I just loved art. I loved how it made me feel. I was very much, there's different kinds of collectors, and I've got notes on that, but I'm very much the aesthete. I would just love painting because I looked at it and loved it. I didn't know much about it. I didn't know why or who, but over time just grew my knowledge, just because I was very interested in it, but always drawn to just looking at the artwork and going, oh my goodness, I think that's beautiful. Over time, we built up our own collection, my husband and I. Even before that, I already had quite a few pieces that I had of my own. And I always had a desire to share that, to share why I think something is so beautiful, or why I think it's a piece that talks to me. It wasn't like that. It was for myself, but I always wanted to share that. And I started by, I was working in a gallery. It was the other break that I had. I was in a corporate career, and when I had my children, I stopped working for a short while, and I had an offer by an artist called Michael Hayes to work in his gallery part-time. And I remember my husband saying to me, but what's he going to pay you? And I said, actually, I don't believe he doesn't pay anything. Because just for me to sit there and see how this works is worth its weight in gold. And his gallery was in Pretoria, and I lived in Joburg. And he said, why are you driving all the way to Joburg, to Pretoria? And I said, I am so happy to do that. And Michael Hayes said to me, why don't you put some of the artwork up in your home? And we did that. We put artwork up in the home, and we had a cocktail evening, and it was absolutely wonderful and lovely success. And that is how I started. So I am very careful when people to call myself a curator, because I think the curator does require a qualification. But over the years, I have learned so much about, I love putting artworks together, how one artwork in its own right changes if you put two others around it or three others around it and group them to the point where they start to tell a story. Absolutely, I love that. And started doing that from home. Then I found spaces to rent in and around Joburg, the beautiful bamboo gallery in Melbourne. It was just wonderful. We hired it for 10 days. It was wonderful, wonderful times, and I grew into that role. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'll give you a bit of my history, but it absolutely comes from the heart. It's an absolute passion. And the other thing is that I don't get it right. We don't get it right, but I have an incredible team that stands by the gallery. Very much, I think, I'd like to think a free flow of communication where we all participate in saying, will that work? That might not work. Can't really think. Sometimes a sounding board of so much. So very much a team effort at the end of the day as well. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I know that you're talking about the role of the curator.
No, but also how you become, I mean, you're an integral part of our art world. I mean, I think.
And you know, Whitecroom is a good place to start and to hold the reins for this space. You know, you've got to do it proud. There's a responsibility to make the absolute most of it. And so I think that it's pure passion. It's pure passion. Sure. Any other questions?
I was going to ask you, how sort of aware are you of your relationship with the artist? You know, so that you're not buying cold. Of course, you know, you might respond to it, but how often do you actually get to know an artist and then buy a piece over years or whatever? Has that happened a lot or not at all?
It's a fantastic question, and it hasn't happened often enough. And I think I've spoken to Donna about it in terms of, you know, this. I really do see the gallery as a linking responsibility between us as buyers and consumers and the artist. And like in my own world, in terms of the insurance game, I always say that the intermediary should never be a linear intermediary, it should be a triangular intermediary. Just the engagement with the artist just makes the purchases so much more special. I've just recently, sort of following an artist now, Charlotte Lowe, out of Cape, young artist, struggling artist, introduced to me by another gallerist, unfortunately not Donna, but yesterday I bought a piece 6 months ago, a few months ago. She sent me the photograph that inspired her to paint that piece. And it's basically a photograph of her on the dam wall. It's a little bit like your story in terms of your paintings here. And I think it just adds another dimension to owning that particular piece, and understanding why, how, when, what was the feeling. The interaction is just it's so valuable. It adds a huge dimension.
Interesting question would be, do you need to like the artist to like the work?
I think for me, I like the work, and then I ask why. What was behind it?
And very often you wouldn't like the artist to be like the work, if it's authentic.
table, so it's our artists that exhibit fairly regularly at the gallery. But we've also got artists that ask to exhibit that we like, whose work we like and we take on. And so if I have to try and count how many artists we actually interact with, there's many. And everybody is so different. You would kind of think artists are all sort of more or less the same. They have creative, so they think, differently, but everybody is so different. And some artists are more difficult to deal with than others, but every one of them, every experience with an artist is rewarding. And I think our role as gallerists is to transcend whether we like it or not. It is really about understanding their work and communicating, and sometimes almost breaking through barriers of communication to understand it.
And sometimes that difficulty with an artist comes out of a kind of insecurity. It can be a rocky relationship with artists and the gallerist. And the galleries take a big chunk of commission, and I think many artists think they can go alone and not pay that commission, but the galleries do earn that commission. They take risks that the artist takes risks and the gallery takes risks. So I think the more confident an artist feels with the gallerist, the easier they're going to be.
Yeah, it's very much a very interesting relationship. It is, I think that, I've just lost my thought. I've had a thought that I wanted to.
Have you ever rejected a work of one of your artists and said, well, that's not good enough? Which brings into the question, is there bad art? Is there good art?
I think I've made selections. So I've said, I would like to select these pieces. So as opposed to saying, well, I'm rejecting those, I'm saying I'm favouring these. Because these, I think, are the ones that really speak to the gallery and its audience. I would hate to say we reject them, because they actually, all artworks are beautiful in their own right.
I'd love to jump in just with a bit of an answer for that, and then leading into a question we received. I would say that we very much do approach sort of selection sometimes, but in a case where we would need to sort of step in and say, okay, this is perhaps not the best thing to do, would more so regard presentation. So if it's a beautiful print, but we're going to glue it straight onto a piece of cardboard or, a piece of board, that's obviously very not advisable, because then we sort of go into the idea again of archivalness. So, you don't want to glue things down, because that's going to yellow over time very quickly, and it will obviously deteriorate the artwork a lot quicker than, you'd want it to. Which leads into our question we received. Can framing affect the value of an artwork? And I pose that to the panel.
I can answer that. So the one thing I have to say about frames is that they are so personal. Everybody has a different idea of how a work should be framed. And I think that the other thing is that framing follows trends. That framing, almost, I don't want to say fashion, because it's not that, but it's certainly, you have, I think there's been a trend over the last while for a frame to be absolutely as simple as possible. So a simple box frame is now very much the way to, or the trend to frame an artwork, as opposed to a more ornate frame. It's still a very personal decision. So I think that the frame shouldn't add value to an artwork, because the artwork should almost have the value in its own right. But there are cases where the frame will add value. And the one is where we are now, certainly in the past, it was never notice that work that's been out, work that was framed 10, 20 years ago, does start showing where the glue was used, the paper starts to yellow. So nowadays, archival framing is a little bit more pricey, but it really, we believe it really is worth the extra cost. The other thing is that art glass is now more popularly used for work that's framed behind glass, and that is more expensive, but it does make such a difference, and I do believe that it would increase the value of an artwork if work on paper is actually framed behind art glass.
I would say that it's got a lot to do with perception. So something that's presented in a way that enhances the artwork, the perception that it's more valuable will exist.
I think so. I think that's a good comment. I think if you've got a very, very large work and it's in a simple box frame, I do think that adds value. So I do think we'll add, certainly the value of the artwork would be enhanced with the beautiful simple box frame. That's my thought. But something else that I wanted to mention is often it is the personal choice of a client not to frame a work, and I think that is also quite lovely to see a work that you decide not to frame. In our collection, for example, we've got quite a few works that haven't been framed, and we've got a work or two where the sides of the work actually show the process, and that for me is such a beautiful part of the artwork that I would never frame that work, because it actually shows how that work was done. So it is a very personal matter, but I like your thought on the perception. I think everybody would look at an artwork and say, we think that is beautifully framed, and somebody else will come. Often it happens that we'll put an artwork in a frame and somebody will say, I love the work, but I really don't like the frame. So it is a very personal
From an
choice.
artist's point of view, an artwork should be able to exist without a frame. It's not dependent on framing. And also it's a bit more liberating for artists to not have to frame, because it's a lot of money up front. You've already put your time, which is your asset. And then the framing on top of that, it's kind of prohibitive sometimes. So if you can see an artwork and accept an artwork without a frame, I think it's always a good thing.
And then the other thing that I think I would like to mention is that often we have older works that are brought into the gallery, or we see older works, and just drawing your attention to the work on the wall in front of the gallery. I love that a frame that was done at a specific time reflects that time and becomes part of the artwork. So often we think of an old frame as something that might need to be changed, or is outdated, or doesn't add to the artwork. But there are certain artworks where, when it was framed in that time and it's in good condition, I think that does add value to the art. Yes.
I wanted to ask how and when were you introduced to art?
Would you like all three of us? I think I've mentioned that. Sorry, we didn't hear the question. Okay, so the question for all three of us is how and when were we introduced to art? So I can't even remember how young I was. I just love beautiful artworks that were produced from the heart, and what felt for me that they were produced from the heart. So from a very young age, I just loved the fact that there was a creative process in producing art, and loved to have that in my space. So I think maybe I was about 8 or 9, and I never looked back.
them learning to talk. It's what they do naturally, and it's just sad that usually at about 8 that gets kind of stamped out one way or another. I can remember that feeling. We were given a big box of crayons that had its own stand and they were kind of in rows. I remember that feeling of getting that and a ream of paper. I remember exactly where I was, what time of the day it was. So it was obviously important to me. And then my granny had delusions of grandeur, so she made prints of very romantic memoir paintings that covered. She had a window through to another room that she didn't want to be transparent, so she put these into the paintings. And I remember my amazement at these really quite horrible paintings, but I was amazed that one could be transported by an image. That's what it is.
I think for me, my dad was an architect, and he was more of a visual architect than a technical architect. So it was more the image as opposed to the form, as opposed to practicality. And I remember at a very young age, he used to take us out into the country with our easels, and he actually made us. When I say us, I was the oldest of three brothers. And I've got to say, probably out of the three, I was probably more attracted to the arts than the other two. But yeah, it started from there. As a practicing architect, I was just, his sketches, his drawings, it was at the time that CAD wasn't invented, so because everything was on that side. So I think there was a little bit of disappointment that I wasn't an architect.
Can I add something? So my children obviously grew up watching me paint and draw, so they think it's a completely normal thing to do. And when my daughter went on her first play date, she was about 3, and when she came home, I was a bit anxious because she was a bit, sorry Joe, it's a bit socially awkward. She said, "Yeah, it was nice, but I don't know where the studio is." And that just said to me that she was so used to the idea that everybody had an art studio and made art. And lucky girl, I wish all children could have that.
I think Brom had a question.
Yeah, just before the time, Henry, maybe you can address this. If you and your spouse have different tastes in art, how do you deal with that?
Persistence. Persistence. Donna, you've experienced it. Just recently, Samantha bought the most abstract of painting without me saying something, do anything, which was actually quite unbelievable. I said, where did that come from? So obviously something we've merged into a common taste. So I think it's about communication, and there's sometimes I will see something that I can project into a space, and she will see something that, well, she won't see it. And then I put it there, and she says, "Oh, okay, wow, all right." That works. Which is kind of contradicting my, art in a sort of stylistic way. That's not. I hope that's not how we buy art.
I have a bit of an issue when I may be approached by a client who says, "I love that work and I'm interested in buying it," and they go through the whole process of getting closer and kind of almost making a decision, and then they say, "But I have to ask my spouse." It's like, oh. Because no two people are going to love a painting in the same way and as in the same amount. And so I think the collection needs to be a combination of two personalities if you live together, and you'll have to put up with some work that you like.
Exactly, it's compromises. It's basically compromises.
And often if that line comes up, I have to ask my spouse. I know everyone has to ask one's spouse, but so much more likely that the sale will fall through if one has to ask one's spouse.
Quite often I don't sort of say sorry afterwards.
Yeah.
So just in my position, I have obviously had access and so wonderfully, almost first access to art before it goes on show. And so often Bruce would say, "Where does that come from?" And I'd say, "Well, we've had it for so long." It was there, and it's been there for. And so we'd always chuckle because people would speak about buying a pair of shoes and hiding it for a while until you wear it and say, "Of course, I've worn this many times." And it was like a art collection. And so when they buy bites, you'll find all kinds of devious ways to make it happen, to bring it home. I think persistence is one of them. And so I was always taking the lead, but I could be quite sneaky about it. Anyway,
I have to also add something that I've noticed over the years, that I have more women clients who are making decisions independently of any partnership that they may have. It wasn't like that in the beginning, but it's definitely like that now. And when I was doing a bit of digging, I found some interesting information, and I need to check it more, but it was an article in a reputable newspaper saying that for every 100 rand that women, it was in dollars, but for every 100 rand that men earn as an artist, women make 10.
Sure.
Yeah, that's quite startling. But although they're coming off a lower base, the women are, the value is increasing 29% faster than men at the moment. So,
Some contemporary art.
yeah.
I think the other thing from a buying point of view, and it's still growing, is that if a woman or with either partner has independent funds, so that you can buy without affecting the bucket,
Yeah.
the partnership bucket, then you have far more choice in buying something that is your choice and not necessarily going to be your partner's.
Yeah.
Because if it's your money, you can spend it on
But
whatever.
that doesn't help with the fact that you both have to live with that art, which is kind of stuff.
But then it's what, yeah. You can always put something where they don't go off.
Exactly.
Any other questions?
What about the material that it's like paper versus canvas? Is there anything in terms of durability? I know you spoke about the glass and all that sort of thing, but is there more value in a canvas, for example, than a face?
Sorry, I'll hand it over to. But in terms of as you buy art, I mean, oil on canvas as opposed to acrylic on canvas, as opposed to watercolors. I mean, these are.
Bit of a hierarchy.
It's a hierarchy of where your cost base is in terms of an art piece, right?
Not necessarily, partly, but I think it's got a lot to do with durability.
the longevity.
I think oil painting kind of wins in that sense always. Art on paper is not going to last as long. But I've noticed recently, I think it's just a sense that art on paper is becoming more acknowledged as a worthwhile investment. It might be worth just touching on the idea of multiples versus single artworks, because printmaking is interesting in that sense. This is a lithograph. I made it at the Artist's Place, which is just outside Waterloo. It was made in collaboration with Mark Atwood, and a lot of people don't understand this process. So this is actually an original work as opposed to a reproduction. So a reproduction would be usually these days a digital copy of something. This is made by printing a number of plates have an intrinsic value that's higher than the reproduction.
I think also when we talk about durability and longevity, it's quite interesting that I can work on paper, watercolor, ink on paper. When we say that oil on canvas has a longer longevity, I think you're talking about centuries as opposed to maybe watercolors lasting for decades. So in your lifetime, work on paper will still always be there. Perhaps in your next generation or the generation after, the work on paper will fade. But the oil on canvas will be there for centuries. So I always say it's not like it's going to fade in a short time, not in the short term, but
I think where you can see it clearly as a buyer in terms of the if you go to Strauss, for example, and you take Battis, if Battis's oil on canvas will reach a different price to oil on board, will reach a different price to when the layman looks at a Battis. Well, why did that Battis is at that level and that Battis is at that level? And that's also taking into account the different works. And we've had this discussion before in terms of that Battis could be an oil on canvas compared to that oil on canvas. Same dimensions. It is a Battis. Why is there differentiating price? Okay, let's not go there. But I think the question is a little bit just from an understanding point of view. Why would you go to an auction and look at a PLF from a print point of view, and that their holding prices are 30,000, whereas an oil on board and an oil on canvas of the same artist is
up to 20 million.
Yeah. So those are the differences.
I think just to touch on another thing that related, sometimes difference in price in work, not necessarily you talk about medium there, but artists, especially established artists, have kind of seminal works. And when you can see the history of an artist, you can see perhaps that work was a jumping off point for a whole stream of work. And generally those, if you know what to look for, are more valuable. And if you ask all artists, they'll know when they made that one work that was suddenly perhaps a departure or a new stream.
That's what you've got to watch out for.
That's what you
developing.
Yes. It's not necessarily the artist's best work.
A great artist in terms of tracking his development is Picasso, for example. It's this unbelievable story. That's
yeah. And when you saw the first work of what this new kind of stream, you wouldn't necessarily have known where it was going.
Yeah.
Hindsight.
There was lots to talk about.
Lots to talk about, and so I want to thank you for being here and for giving us this opportunity to speak to you. We also learned so much from it. We really hope to offer more of these types of talks going forward. I think the gallery exists, the ecosystem exists partly, mainly because there is an audience that comes to appreciate the art. So it's really lovely that you're here and to engage with us. Please talk to us about any more questions you might have, any suggestions that you have for the gallery going forward. We always love to hear from our viewership. So thank you for today. I think we're doing more sparkling wine. And thank you. Look forward to